do you want to bring back fox hunting?
Look, this is a subject on which you either are for it or you're against it. I've always supported fox hunting, but crucially I'm not saying that I'm going to bring it back. What I'm saying is that we'll have a free vote in Parliament, so MPs will be able to make up their own mind on this issue. But look, this isn't the most important issue facing people at this election. I think the most important issue is about who's going to provide the leadership for the future to take us through Brexit and beyond.
Sue Johnson, why won't you cut foreign aid? She says there are too many homeless people here, food banks, we're giving away billions to other parts of the world. She doesn't want that to happen.
Well, it's 0.7% of our GDP, yes, and we're committed to that. We're doing it, I think, for a number of very good reasons. I think we are, the fifth biggest economy in the world. There's a moral reason for us doing it. But also, if you look at some of the great challenges we've got across the world, if you've got migration challenges, counter-terrorism, actually helping people in their own countries to be able to get an education, to be able to get employment, so that they've got opportunities in their own countries, actually will help with some of those other issues that we're having to deal with. For example, we don't want to see vacuums being created in countries, unstable governments, which lead to terrorists being able to exploit that and potentially harm us. What we do in aid helps to stop that.
Linda Ray says she can't vote for you, or indeed anyone, until she knows what your plans are for the future legal, residential and fiscal rights of EU citizens living here.
Well, I want to be able to guarantee those rights for EU citizens who are living here, and I expect that I will be able to do that. But
any idea how quickly?
Well, I think as the UK Prime Minister, it's only right that I have a care for UK citizens who are living in other European countries. So I want those to be reciprocal, rights to be looked at reciprocally. And I put it in my Article 50 letter to the EU when I triggered the start of these negotiations. I want it to be done early. There's some sign through their own guidelines for the negotiations that other countries want it to be done early as well. I'm afraid I'm going to be honest with, I think it was Linda, I can't put a date on it. But there is a goodwill there to do this as soon as possible.
Ezzy thinks that you should say something about the killings of young people in London in a surge in knife crime.
It is. I mean, we're all worried when we see a surge in knife crime. Overall, since 2010, knife crime is down. But there have been some worrying cases, obviously, in particularly over the last year. We have done a number of things that should help in terms of knife crime, increasing the sentences, the mandatory sentence, if somebody's being caught twice, prosecuted twice for carrying a knife. We've introduced a new offence of threatening somebody with a knife in a public place or somewhere like a school. And we've also taken action against the sale of zombie knives, there was a time when those were one of the real issues people were raising. And we're working and continue to work with retailers, online and offline retailers, about accessibility to knives, because I think that's a key issue too.
Caroline Redwood says, do the right thing and give Nigel Farage a knighthood. You're not going to answer. Right, let's move on to Andy Clark, who's talking about a policy that you've actually announced today. He says, how can the average working person afford to take off a year from work to be a carer? Because you've announced that you want people to have more rights to take leave.
That's right. I mean, overall, the package we've announced today is the biggest enhancement of workers' rights ever given by a Conservative government. And it does include this right to have time off to care for a relative. Increasingly, we see people having to look after elderly relatives.
How are they going to support themselves?
It is unpaid, and that's the proposal. And I recognise that will be difficult for some people, but I think it is important that we're saying to employers, good businesses will want to help, I think, their workers in this way. There are other things we've got in the package as well, such as helping people to get back to work after they've taken time off, returnships. I was at a very good organisation in Oxford today, Tech Pixies, helping women back into the workplace after they've had children. And of course we're also committed to ensuring that the national living wage continues to rise in line with median earnings.
Now you've talked about increasing workers' rights. Jane Guashi says, however, that the increase in fees when you go to a tribunal in a work dispute makes it almost impossible for workers to enforce those rights.
Well, on anything like fees for the employment tribunals, it's getting the balance, and I think we have got the balance, because what we saw was a large number of the employment tribunals being inundated with large numbers of cases, which effectively got absolutely nowhere. I think it is right that there is some, that the fees are set at a point where, I think if people do have genuine cases, they will take those to the employment tribunal.
Now, Nettie Proctor says that the austerity cuts have hit vulnerable people while your government has cut tax for the rich.
Now, what we've done in relation to welfare changes, we have made some welfare changes, but what we see in those is that we have been focusing a lot of those on people who are most vulnerable. So if you look at disability payments, for example, disability benefits, £50 billion a year, and focusing those who are on those who are most in need. But in all of our changes for welfare benefits, like for job seekers and disabled people, we've also putting an emphasis of trying to help people get back into the workplace. I think work is the best route out of poverty, and putting an emphasis on ensuring that work always pays. The new universal credit, that's, key aim of that is ensuring work always pays. So we help people to get back into a position where they are able to support themselves.
Peter Sweetmore, what assurances will you give to those with lifelong degenerating illnesses that their allowances won't be cut?
Well, one of the things we've done for people with these lifelong degenerating illnesses is it used to be the case that for certain benefits they had to go back and be reassessed on a regular basis. And actually, for a lot of people, they said, well, I've got, the condition I have, it isn't going to improve. Why should I keep having to go back, keep proving that I should have access to my benefits? We've said, no, you don't. For those people where the condition won't improve, you won't have to go back to be tested again and again to have access to your benefits.
Arnold Jameson makes the point that previous governments have made pledges about reducing child poverty. Will you make a pledge to reduce absolute child poverty?
Well, we have seen absolute child poverty reduce. I think it's something like a couple of 100,000 children.
Latest projections are for rises in child poverty, as you know.
Yeah, what we've seen over the last few years under the government is that we have seen child poverty coming down. But I think, again, if you're dealing with child poverty, one of the things, there are several things you need to do. One of those is about helping families into work so that they are able to provide for themselves and for their children. I think it's something like 800,000 fewer children now in workless households. I think taking that forward is an important part of dealing with child poverty.
Now, Rosie Smith-Viles asked a question which I imagine we're going to get quite a lot of. It's about the WASPI issue, about women of a certain age getting their pensions much later than they'd expected. She wants to know what you're going to do to help those women.
Well, we've already made changes in the arrangements to recognise the impact on people. So nobody should see a change of more than 18 months in their timetable in relation to access to the pension. And we put an extra £1 billion in to the system in order to cover that. But look, this is overall this is a difficult issue. We are equalising women and men's pension ages, but also as we all live longer, we're having to raise that pension age, so people will be in the workplace for longer.
Patrick Dunn asks a question about the cost of rail fares. He said he's just discovered he can get 3 return flights to Dublin from East Midlands Airport for the same price as a day return trip to London by train from Chesterfield, which does sound extraordinary, really. A lot of people, well, we do have, the statistics show we have the highest train fares in Europe.
And we also have actually quite a complicated system of train fares. And one of the things we've been working with and talking to train companies about is actually trying to simplify the system of train fares so that people actually are able to have easier access to what would be the cheaper fares for themselves. Because often it's very difficult, I think, for people to identify how they can perhaps travel more cheaply than that.
Sam Selden is asking, will you put more money into the NHS on top of what you've already promised?
Well, we'll set out, obviously, when we set out our manifesto later this week, the details of this, but we have put by 2020 it will be £10 billion extra into the National Health Service. Overall, in the 5 years from 2015 to 2020, we're spending £500 billion on the NHS. So as well as extra money going to the NHS, I think we need to make sure that the money we are spending is being spent as effectively as possible with an absolute focus on patient care.
So was there a hint there that there might be some more money?
There was a hint that you might have to wait to the manifesto.
OK. Now, Thomas Wiblin is concerned you might take away bus passes from pensioners and the disabled.
Well, I'm not going to say, again, there may be a number of questions that will come in which are issues that will be addressed when we publish our manifesto later this week. So I'd rather wait until we publish that package in the manifesto for people to see what we're going to do.
Okay. Janet Welsh, there have been quite a lot of these very concerned, this is Janet Welsh, very concerned about the way you have changed personal injury payments. Lots of concerns that genuinely disabled people are losing quite a lot of money.
Well, this is part of trying to ensure that we're focused, first of all, that we focus payments on those who most need it, those who are most vulnerable. There are a number of issues I know that people raise around these PIPs, as they're called. One is about the assessment process, and we've been making changes in that to make that a better process for people. But in addition to these payments, of course, the other thing we do want to do is try to help those disabled people who are able to get into the workplace to do so. And so it's not just about the personal payment that they receive, it's also about the support that is available to help to get them into the workplace.
John Bramley asks a question. I mean, this may be something you don't want to divulge, but I'm going to put it to you. He says, as an insulin-dependent diabetic, he's delighted that somebody with his condition has become Prime Minister, and he wondered if you would talk a little bit about what regime you're on.
Yes, I mean, as he knows, I'm a type 1 diabetic. That means that when I eat, I have to inject insulin, which I do, and there's a sort of, you have a base dose as well. So I will be injecting myself 4 or 5 times a day with insulin. 4 or 5 times a day?
Yes. Crikey. And how I mean, is it just become second nature?
Yeah, funnily enough, I met a group of diabetics yesterday morning who were off doing a sponsored walk for Diabetes UK, and we were talking about this, and you just get into a routine. You depend on that insulin, and you just build that routine into your daily life. And I think the person who asked the question, as a diabetic himself, I'm sure will recognise that. But the crucial thing to me is being a diabetic doesn't stop you from doing anything.
I don't think this is the hardest question you're ever going to receive, but Laura Emily Dunn wants to know whether your love of fashion, whether you think it's inspiring young women to be bolder in the workplace or even consider public service or politics. So do you think your interest in clothes is drawing people into politics? That's a tough question.
There is a story which I actually told on another broadcast outlet, I have to say, the other day about a young woman in the House of Commons who, when I was in the lift with her and commented on her shoes, she said it was my shoes that got her interested in politics. So I think there is a good side to it. But I think what I would hope for women out there, be it in getting into politics or in business, in the workplace generally, be yourself. I think that, I mean, obviously there is some employment where you have to wear a particular uniform, but generally don't be afraid to be yourself.
Now, perhaps surprisingly, I've got a question in from Jeremy Corbyn of Islington. He says, hello, Theresa May. As Prime Minister, you've served your elite friends by giving them tax cuts when wages have stagnated. House building is at its lowest since the 1920s. There are 20,000 fewer police on our streets since 2010, and the NHS is in crisis. Do you not think the British people deserve to see he and you debate live and on television?
Well, what I think is more important is actually that I and he take question directly from the voters. I don't think people get much out of seeing politicians sort of having a go at each other. I think people want to hear directly. And of course, in answer to some of the points that he's made, 900,000 homes have been built since 2010. Under Labour, we saw, I think it was the house building went down by about 45%, homes purchase went down by 40%, and we announced a new deal with councils and housing associations over the weekend to help them to be able to build more homes, which then after a period of time, 10 to 15 years, would be available to under right to buy.
Now, there's a very interesting question from William McGinty. He says that the SNP agreed that the last independence referendum vote would settle the question, and he says that if you would give a commitment that there will not be a second independence referendum vote for, in his words, a generation, you'll have his vote for a generation. So do you want to promise him there will definitely not be a second independence vote for Scotland for a generation?
Well, first of all, I agree with William that the SNP at the time of the 2014 referendum not only said actually that it was a once-in-a-generation referendum vote, but they said it was once-in-a-lifetime vote. I don't think it's right to be talking about a second independence referendum, particularly now, when we're facing the Brexit negotiations. This is the time when the UK should be working together and not pulling apart. And I think the SNP has had a tunnel vision about this independence issue. And what we need to be doing is making sure we're getting the right deal out of Brexit.
Tegan Maddox makes a point that many young people make, that even with a full-time job, it's impossible to get onto the property ladder. Can you do anything for Tegan?
Well, that's, I mean, one of the reasons why we've introduced a number of schemes like the Help to Buy and the Help to Save, the increasingly looking at a flexibility in the housing market around things like shared ownership to help people to get on the housing ladder. But also we need to build more homes. And we've put some plans forward some weeks ago to do just that, to free up the market to ensure that we are building more homes.
Francis Farmer, crime is at horrific levels. Daily car thefts and burglaries around where he, or she lives, sorry, it's Francis with an E, where she lives. And she says that her local police force are blaming lack of funds for an inability to crack down. Well,
in fact, the overall figures, I don't obviously know where Francis lives, so I don't know about her particular locality, but the overall figures show that crime is at record low levels at the moment. Yes, the police, we did have an impact on police budgets as part of the public sector. They played their part in what we've been able to do to strengthen the economy and deal with the deficit that the Labour government left us. But what's important for policing is that they actually are able to deal with the new sorts of crime that come along. And of course, particularly, we know that the issues around cybercrime are an issue at the moment, and we're putting some more money into cybercrime so that the police are able to deal with the new types of crime that we see.
Harry Marvin wants to know why we still sell arms to Saudi Arabia to be used in Yemen, which he says, and there's a lot of concern over this, has resulted in, you know, extraordinary numbers of deaths and poverty.
Well, we have, as a country, we have strict rules and rigorous rules about the sale of arms. Saudi Arabia has been a partner for the UK for many years, and for good reason. Our work with Saudi Arabia actually helps to keep people safe here in the UK. We do look very carefully at any requests, obviously, for arms sales, as I say, and when there are reports of incidents where arms might have been used and perhaps civilians have been affected, have been killed and affected in Yemen, then we do require the Saudi Arabian government, we ask them to make sure that they're investigating those incidents and report on those and learn lessons from those. But our partnership with Saudi Arabia has helped to keep lives safe here in the UK.
I'm getting a lot of questions in on fox hunting. I mean, you said it shouldn't be central to this campaign, but a lot of people feel very passionately about it. Adam Davis says he backs you fully on all other issues, but not on what he sees as a terrible throwback to crueler days.
It's, as I said earlier, I mean, I think fox hunting is something that you either believe in the sense that you support it, or you don't. You really dislike it intensely. Sorry?
Have you ever been fox hunting?
No, I've never been fox hunting.
So it's a sort of freedom issue for you, is it?
Well, I think there are different issues. If you look at some of the research that's been done over time, there's an issue about how you actually cull the fox population, because there is a necessity of keeping fox numbers down. And some of the other forms of dealing with foxes can be cruel. So, as I say, it's an issue that my view is it should be a free vote for Parliament, so members of Parliament individually will be able to exercise their view, their discretion on this matter. But I think what most people do feel strongly about it, but I think there are many other issues that people will look at when they look at the clear choice they're going to make on June the 8th. As to who's going to be Prime Minister, me or Jeremy Corbyn?
Nathan Boynes wonders whether you agree that the voting age should be lowered to 16.
No, I don't. Again, this is another one where, I mean, you have to set it obviously at a point. I think it's right that it's at the point where people normally would be leaving education or training. But what I would say is, and it's a bit of like a response to the very first question from Matthew that came in, is I would urge young people who are eligible to vote to actually go out and exercise their vote on June the 8th.
Linda Bailey wonders why you haven't been to the Royal College of Nursing conference as Tim Farron and Jeremy Corbyn did.
Because I've been doing other things. My campaign is about getting out and about, meeting people in a whole variety of environments, which is what I've been doing over the weeks of the campaign so far and will continue to do, and across the United Kingdom.
Henry Palmer says there is no direct correlation between cutting corporation tax and people being better off. So why are you pressing on with your plans to cut corporation tax to 17%?
Well, I want the United Kingdom to be a country where people can look at it and say this is a great place to start a business, it's a great place to grow a business, it's a great place to do business. I want that because it's about jobs for people here in the UK, and I want to ensure that we spread prosperity and jobs and growth across the whole of the United Kingdom. Actually, if you look at the figures, since we cut corporation tax to 20%, we've increased the amount of money we've taken in from corporation tax. So the rate's been cut, but we're getting more money for it. And of course, that's more money that can be spent on the things that people want in terms of public services.
Sarah Rees, and there obviously are quite a lot of nurses engaging in this debate today. She wants to know why you allow nurses who do such an important job to be paid a fraction of what the bosses of our big companies are paid.
Well, certainly. I mean, the average pay for a nurse is 31,000. And there's, if you like, there's sort of two issues in the question that's been asked. One is about what we do in the National Health Service and nurses' pay. And we do want nursing to be an attractive profession. There are over 12,000 more nurses now in the NHS than there were in 2010. We see more nurses. We see, I think, over 50,000 nurses in training now. But of course, we can only fund the NHS if we've got a good economy and a strong economy. And that's why we've built our plans for developing the economy for the future. On the question of corporate bosses, and we've already made some proposals to deal with some of the issues around irresponsible bosses. So I want to see greater protection for workers' pensions from irresponsible bosses, and also a greater say for shareholders in the remuneration in the pay that those senior bosses do get.
Again, lots of questions on disability payments, and there's one here about a nephew with a severe learning disability, and the man from obviously the outsourced company responsible for giving evidence not turning up in a court case, and then, you know, there are others about, there's one from Adam Knight about the misery that he says you put disabled people through by reducing their benefits. Again, this is such an issue of passion for people. Will there be anything in your manifesto that you think will reassure people that people who are genuinely disabled and can't work are going to be properly supported?
Well, we are. One of the things we've been doing, I mean, there have been a number of changes to the disability benefit regime, and one of the things we have been doing, as I mentioned earlier, is focusing payments on those who are most in need. But then for those who are, some of the changes that may be being referred to have been around those who are considered to be eligible to get into the workplace, where there are also other support available to help them to get into the workplace. But I think the questioner has touched on this issue of the assessment that is made, and we recognise that there have been some issues around that process of making assessments. And of course, one of the interesting areas is in relation to learning disabilities and indeed mental health. Obviously, this is an area of particular concern in making sure that assessments are right, because very often people feel, I know people with learning disabilities or mental health feel that because they don't necessarily look as if there's a problem, sometimes people assess them in a different way. We want to make sure that we're getting those assessments absolutely right for those people. And of course, I've announced quite a lot of changes that I want to make for mental health so that we get away from the stigma of mental health.
Liam Warnock says, why do you say you're doing everything in Britain's best interest and then stick a Chinese and French nuclear power plant in the UK and use French steel in Trident submarines? Why aren't you buying British? Well,
on the answer to the steel in the submarines, I understand it's because there isn't British steelmakers who are making the particular kind of steel that is required for that. What I do want to see is more steel from companies here in Britain being used, and I was very pleased to go to Scunthorpe the other day and sit down with some of the workers from British Steel, which that name is now has been reintroduced, and talk to them about the areas where there are future possibilities. They have a particular capability, a particular expertise in rail, for example. And as we see rail developments in the UK, there have to be proper contracting processes and so forth. But I would like to see British steel being used.
Samantha Wren says, Jeremy Corbyn has said he'll tax the rich, which will include himself, given his wage. Why don't you do this so that everyone gets a share of the pie?
Well, I want to ensure that we see prosperity and growth around the country. I want to see higher paid jobs. I want to see higher paid jobs for people. But what you also want is to ensure that we've got an economy that is strong, that is providing those jobs. And that means you have a tax system, which does mean people who are richer pay more. In fact, the top 1% of taxpayers are paying a higher percentage, a higher burden of tax than they did in any year under the last Labour government.
Brendan Russell Cooper, why is a leader who says, I think he means you, you'll make a first nuclear strike, which would kill millions, stronger than a leader who'll protect this nation without resorting to genocide?
Well, first of all, I think it is important that if we have a nuclear deterrent, that we recognise that that should be capable of being used, and that's what I've said in the past. But of course, what we want to see in defending our country is a leader who stands up for our armed forces. Jeremy Corbyn has spoken in the past about abolishing the army. We want to see a leader who is committed to the security that we need in this country. As Home Secretary for 6 years, obviously I was responsible for MI5 and counter-terrorism matters. I saw the excellent work that our police and security services do on a daily basis. They deserve our support, as do our armed forces.
Sarah wrote, don't sell off our NHS, fund it appropriately. What are your NHS plans?
Nobody is selling off the NHS. We're committed to the NHS remaining free at the point of use. What we want to ensure is that it is funded properly. We're putting extra money in. It's record levels of funding for the NHS. But crucially, you can only do that if you've got the economy to provide the funding. If you've got the economy that is developing the taxes that can be put in and the money that can be put into the NHS. That means a strong economy. It means not wrecking the economy. Labour's nonsensical economic policy would wreck the economy. That would mean less money for the NHS in future.
You have announced plans, particularly to avoid discrimination at work, for mental health, but you haven't announced a big chunk of new money, and Chris Owen wants to know, will you do that? He's deeply concerned about his inability to get mental health help from the NHS.
Well, I accept that there is more to do in the NHS for mental health. We have brought in parity of esteem for mental health with physical health in the NHS. I think that's very important. And we now see over £11 billion a year being spent on mental health in the NHS. And it's something like 1,400 people every day are getting mental health treatment under the NHS. But I think there's more for us to do overall on mental health. Crucially, we need to remove the stigma on mental health. That's partly why I want to change the Mental Health Act. I want to renew our legislation on mental health so it's up to date. I want to ensure that people can't be discriminated against in the workplace because of mental health. I want to ensure that in every secondary and primary school there's one member of staff who's properly trained to identify mental health issues and knows then what to do and how to deal with them. Because if you can address these issues at an early stage, then it will be better for those individuals. They're less likely to develop in a way that leads to significant crisis later.
Steve John wants to know why you changed your position on remaining in the EU. He says that was a big U-turn and it means he can't trust you.
Well, I did. He's right that I campaigned for and voted for remaining in the EU. I said at the time, I explained my reasons, it was a balanced judgment. I also said the sky won't fall in if we vote to leave and if we leave. The reason I think it's important as Prime Minister to deliver on the vote that took place is that Parliament said to the British people, it is your choice. The majority voted to leave the European Union. I think if people are going to feel they can trust politicians, then government needs to respect that vote and deliver on it.
We've had a staggering 22,000 questions so far. I don't think we're going to get through all of them. I'm doing my best, but my goodness, there is a lot to get through. So let's have a look. I really want to try and find something that we haven't yet covered. I mean, this is a sort of interesting question about campaigning. And you're here on Facebook today, reaching out through a new way of campaigning. There's quite a lot of concern. This is a question raised by Natalia Quinton. There's quite a lot of concern about how in the EU referendum, very sophisticated data analytical techniques were used to target ads and information at vulnerable people and change people's minds in a way that some people think is bad for democracy. Is this issue of campaigning on social media and indeed whether there's a level playing field, and is this something that has been brought to your attention? Do you have any views on it?
Well, yes, I think it's important. First of all, I think it's important that we do campaign in new ways, like this effectively Facebook interview that we're doing now, and social media. Obviously, social media has a huge amount of good and benefits to people, but there can be problems with it in terms of the sort of information people can put up there and whether those who are seeing it are able to, the sort of fake news issue about whether people are able to distinguish between what is real and what's not.
And if somehow fake news is fed to people who are particularly susceptible to a point of view, that must be a concern.
Yes, it is a concern, and other things. I mean, you mentioned the EU referendum campaign there. During the Conservative Party leadership campaign, we started to see some pretty nasty videos being sent round about me. So again, people
made up stuff.
Yes,
not only nasty, but also,
I didn't actually see any of them, but I'm told that it was in the realms of claims that weren't accurate. So it is a concern, but of course, as I say, social media does bring huge benefits as well. But there are things that I think we can do on social media. So, for example, one of the things I want is for people to be able to be entitled to ask social media companies to remove their records for up to the age of 8 when they were 18, because I think a lot of people, will use these as youngsters, and then perhaps later on discover when they get into the employment market that somebody's looked at something they did when they were 15. And it's had an impact. I think that's important.
Clara Wigo says, do you care how completely fed up we all are of politics and politicians? Half of the country can't even see the point in voting anymore, she says.
Well, I'm very sorry if she feels like that about voting. And I would just ask her to have another think about that when it comes to June the 8th and this general election, because there's a huge challenge that we've got to get right in this country of Brexit, and it's not just about Brexit and the negotiations and about having that strong and stable leadership to take us through that, but it's also about taking us beyond Brexit. We're at the start of a new future for the UK, and that's why I think the vote matters, and there's a very clear choice between myself and Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. So I would hope that was it Clara would think again about voting. To me, politics is not a game. It is about decisions that are taken that affect people's lives. Getting that Brexit negotiation right is about jobs here in the UK. It's about people's standard of living for the future.
I think you deserve an award, because I think that's the first time you've used one of your famous catchphrases, and we've now been going for more than half an hour. Now, Andrew Wagner, I'm a Conservative and a firefighter. His pay goes up 1%, but everything else goes up much, much more than that. Isn't it time that he, firefighters, NHS police, got a proper pay rise?
Well, if we look at what we've had to do across the public sector, and yes, I recognise that those pay rises have been capped at that 1%.
For people doing a vital job?
For people doing vital jobs. In some areas, of course, people are also able to get progression payments. So, for example, staff in the NHS would typically, on average, be getting increases around 3%. But it was necessary to do that because of the situation that we found ourselves in the economy and the deficit we inherited from the last Labour government. Now, we've brought that deficit down by 2/3. There is still more to do. And I think it's right that as we look at that, we have to be careful about public spending. But I recognise that this has been a period of time. But we can only ensure that we're putting the money into the NHS, into our firefighting, into the police and so forth, in our public services, if we've got the economy that is able to generate the funds that can go into it.
Now, Nigel Clark raises a question which is in a lot of people's minds, which is things like 0 hours contracts and the absence of rights for workers. He says, when are you going to bring back permanent jobs which went under one of your predecessors, Margaret Thatcher, he says?
Well, I think, first of all, on 0 hours contracts, of course, it's the Conservatives in government that have done something about exploitative 0 hours contracts, the ones that meant that people couldn't have another job. Some people actually say they want to be on that sort of flexible 0 hour contract. But the wider point of the question was about jobs here. I want to look to a future where we're able to ensure that we do have more of those permanent jobs, but the jobs we have are higher paid, that we are making sure that young people coming through into the employment market are getting the skills they need for those higher paid jobs, that people have opportunities for retraining through their life as the job market changes. I think that's important. But that means getting the Brexit negotiations right. It means having a plan for a stronger Britain for the future. And it's me and my team that have that plan for a stronger Britain, for ensuring we lock in our economic security for the future.
Eileen Howson, can you do something to help our ex-servicemen who served this country in Northern Ireland and are now being, in her words, hunted down in a witch hunt?
Well, I know this is an issue of concern for a lot of people. I think what's important, if you look at the various agreements that have been come to in Northern Ireland, this question of legacy is something that is central to a number of those. I think what we need to see for the future is that these legacy cases are dealt with in a fair and proportionate way.
Jack Young, £62.70 for 35 plus hours work a week, caring for a loved one, is so far below the minimum wage. He wants to know why carers like him get so little.
Well, these are obviously within the welfare system as a whole. These are judgments that are made about the amounts that are available to people. I mean, I think it is important that we do obviously enable some people, provide that level of support for people who are there caring and who do an amazing job.
Chris Tennant, much of Europe and even Islamic countries have banned the burqa on security issues. Why won't you do the same?
Because I think it's up to a woman to choose how she dresses. There will be circumstances in which it's important, for example, that somebody doesn't wear a veil. They might be required to remove it, for example, at going through the border to identify themselves. But overall, I think women should have a choice as to how they dress.
Very worrying that parental rights can be stripped away. This is from Hayley Wainwright. When no neglect is taking place, could you grant parental rights over hospitals, starting with the Charlie Gard case? There's been a few about the Charlie Gard case, actually.
I mean, I think this sort of area is where it's about getting, if you like, getting the balance right, because we want to ensure that where there are cases of neglect, where there is a need for action to be taken, it's possible to do that. But of course, people who are in that position have to deal with those cases very sensitively.
Helen McCallum says that animal welfare and cruelty cases are not dealt with properly by the courts. People get off with too light sentences.
Well, I know this is a subject that is of concern, major concern to a lot of people in terms of animal welfare and that whole area. I think independent judgments are made by the courts. You know, judges will themselves make an independent judgment as to what is appropriate in the particular case that they've had in front of them.
David Marshall, there's been a few like this. Food banks have increased by 700% during your party's time in power. Doesn't look like a fight against child poverty and poverty in general.
Well, food banks have been around for some time. I remember when I was in opposition, I was asking the then Labour government to ensure that job centre staff would actually point people who they felt needed them to get to food banks, which they had refused to do. We've changed that. So we have seen, yes, that people using food banks. I think the important thing is none of us want to see people having to use food banks, but the important thing is to deal with the causes, which can be complex, as to why people are using food banks. But underlying it is the need to ensure we've got good jobs, higher paid jobs, so that people are able to provide for themselves without having to resort to a food bank.
Emma wants to know why you can't support cannabis legalisation. She says it's the only thing that helps her debilitating anxiety, but she has to be a criminal to get the only thing that helps her.
And there have obviously been some studies into the use of cannabis or derivatives in relation to the medical use. The reason I don't believe in legislating making cannabis use legal is because of the impact that I see it having on too many people in terms of the drug use. And I think what we've seen is stronger forms now being used. I think it can have a real impact on people in terms of their mental health. But it can also, of course, lead to people on going onto harder drugs. And there's a wonderful woman in my constituency, Elizabeth Burton Phillips, who runs something called Drug Fam, which supports families. One of her twin sons, they both started on cannabis when they were at school and went on to heroin, and one of her twin sons committed suicide. This has a huge impact on families.
Nick Burton, school funding is being cut per pupil. The last school he taught in is losing £400 per pupil per year. How can you defend these shortfalls?
Well, first of all, actually, I mean, overall record levels of funding are going into our schools.
But you do know that individual schools are losing, under your new formula, quite a lot of money.
This is what I was going to say, Robert, is that there are two things happening here. One is the question about the level of funding that's going into schools now, and it's around 40 billion. But the other question is about a new formula for distributing the money between schools. And we consulted on that formula. Across the political spectrum, people recognise that the current way of distributing funds among schools is not fair. So we need to address that issue. We've published a proposal, we're consulting on it, and of course in due course we'll bring forward our response in terms of what we think should happen.
There have been a colossal number of questions on the whole PIP thing. I'm going to ask you one more. Over 60% of PIP assessments are overturned on appeal, which seems to indicate that the assessment process is especially brutal.
Well, this is why I think it's right that the Department for Work and Pensions has been and continues to look at that assessment process. Some people say don't have an assessment process, abolish it, but I don't think that's right. I think we need to make sure that we are seeing the money go to those people who need it. But of course we need to constantly be looking at how that process is undertaken so that we make sure that it is a system that is genuinely identifying those who are in need.
Emlyn Gregory, if immigration drives down wages, can you explain why Germany is now going through a period of good wage growth, the best in 40 years, despite taking many more immigrants recently?
Well, Germany has an issue with their demographics, with the population growth, which means that in order to support their economy, they actually have more of a need for migrants to come in. But the evidence here in the UK in the past has been that at the lower end of the income scale, uncontrolled immigration does push wages down and puts pressure on public services. That's why we want to control migration. And of course, when we leave the EU, we'll be able to control migration from the EU as well as controlling it from outside the EU.
Now, we're coming to the end of the 45 minutes. Could you better take, a few more questions? 5 or 6?
More, not 21,000.
No, not, well, we've actually got, believe it or not, more than 33,000 questions, and I promise we're not going to get through every single one of them. But if we could just take, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 more, if that's okay, and then we'll wind it up. Pete Collins, living standards have been declining since the 80s. He says this shows that the economic system is thoroughly discredited.
No, and I think it's, if you look at...
There is an issue about living standards.
There's, of course, people are concerned about, as they start to see inflation higher than it has been in the past. And that is obviously an issue that some people are focusing on. But in terms of the economy and how we deal with the economy, I come back to the point I've made earlier. If we're going to see people able to see their living standards rise, what you need is to ensure that we've got a strong economy, that we've got the jobs, crucially that we're seeing the prosperity and growth spread across the whole of the UK. And that's very much what I want to see. That's why we've brought in drafted a modern industrial strategy to help to encourage growth in all parts of the UK. And we want to see higher paid jobs, better skilled jobs, but crucially also providing the training for people so they can take those jobs on.
Georgina asked a question which puzzles many. Your government, the one that came in 2010, which was initially a coalition, presided over big cuts in public spending, what's known as austerity, and yet the country's debts continued to rise very significantly. Where's the money gone, she asks?
Well, there's a number of reasons. Obviously, first of all, while we have debt, we are paying interest on that debt. Also, there are some things in public spending that you don't control in terms of, as your certain things on welfare, for example, which depend on the numbers of people that are being supported in that system. But it is right that we have, crucially what we've done is, and there's a difference between debt and deficit, but crucially what we've done is reduced that deficit that there was in the economy by 2/3. That's important because as we look ahead, we want to have that stability in the economy, and reducing the deficit is a key part of that.
Steve Anderson, are you going to keep UK law and stop Sharia law from taking root?
There is only one law in rule of law in the UK, and that is UK law. I did, when I was Home Secretary, I actually put in place a review which is ongoing on Sharia law, because there are lots of concerns that this isn't, Islam isn't the only religion which has some religious courts, but there have been concerns about the way in which Sharia law has operated, particularly in discrimination against women. So that is being looked into, but there's only one rule of law, and that's UK law.
A couple more questions and then we'll wind it up. Emily Wood, what have you done to end tax avoidance and tax evasion? I mean, she claims that you're obviously doing far too little.
In fact, we've done quite a lot as a government, and we've recouped, I think, several £billion as a result of the work that has been taken. You always have to be looking to make sure that you're doing more in this particular area. One of the crucial things we've done, as well as changes we've made here in the UK in terms of offences and the action that HMRC has taken in going after tax evasion and avoidance, is actually to take this subject onto the international arena, because often if you're looking, for example, at people operating across a number of countries, you need to be doing it on an international arena, and that's what we've done.
So two more questions. One from Dan, who lives abroad with his Polish partner. He says he simply won't return to Britain until her rights are guaranteed. Won't you please do this?
Well, I think it's important that we are able to guarantee the rights of EU citizens living here, but I also want to see the rights of UK citizens living in the remaining 27 EU countries being guaranteed as well. That's why I say it's a reciprocal arrangement that we're looking for, and I want to see that done at an early stage. It can be quite complex, but I want to see it done at an early stage. So
look, let's wind up. You've been incredibly generous with your time. Thank you so much. Matt Betts, if Theresa May won this election, how long would you remain as Prime Minister? And this is his substantive point. Will you see Brexit to the very end and make sure everything is sorted before you go?
Well, I'm focused, as you might expect me to say, on the election on the 8th of June and winning that election. If I'm elected, I will certainly serve my full term. And that Brexit is obviously due, the 2 years of Brexit negotiations are due to finish in 2019. I've always said there may then be an implementation period, but I want to make sure that Brexit happens and that it's a good deal for the UK.
You want to make sure it happens, and just to be clear, if there, you will oversee all the talks that take us out of the EU, however long it takes, I think is what he wants to know.
Yes, I mean, I think we can do it in 2 years. That's what the Lisbon Treaty says is the time that is set to do it.
But if that turns out to be impossible, you will be around to sort it out. That's what he wants to know.
That's what he wants to know.
That's the commitment he wants to make.
That's the commitment he wants me to make. And as I've said, I think I'm pretty certain it can be done in those 2 years. But that would take us, anyway, a new Parliament will take us through to 2022, which is 3 years beyond the 2019 deadline, and I will be around.
Prime Minister, many thanks for answering as many questions as you could. I think we've got almost 40,000 in total, and sadly we couldn't, but I don't know how many we got through. It felt like a very good number. I found it completely fascinating. So if you've just tuned in and you just caught the end of it, you can watch the whole thing in just a few minutes on ITV's own Facebook page and on the ITV News website. We'll be back with similar Facebook live sessions with the other party leaders, but thank you so much for all your absolutely brilliant questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get through all 40,000. See you all again soon.